Shuttered businesses, abandoned houses and thousands on the tarmac of the airport attempting to flee. Afghanistan's capital Kabul on the first day of what the Taliban calls the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Taliban fighters who had entered the city were seen unfurling the militant group's flags and brandishing weapons while roaming in seized government vehicles. The bustling metropolis close to a standstill.
These are the scenes pouring in from Afghanistan on its first day after the Taliban took the capital Kabul, the fall of the Afghan government, the ongoing chaos at its airport, and the new reality that's set in. There's a constant stream of helicopters over the city, and at the airport at least 5 people have been killed in the turmoil. It's not immediately clear how they died, whether by stampede or gunfire or something else, although at least 2 gunmen have been killed there by U.S. forces in separate incidents, according to a U.S. official who says the gunmen had fired into the crowd. Afghans, residents, and those fearing reprisals from the Taliban were still flooding the area Monday, desperately trying to find a way out of the country. A U.S. official says troops that have taken over the airport had to fire their guns in the air to keep people off the tarmac and the planes flying. The U.S. says it's trying to get tens of thousands of at-risk Afghans who worked for the government out. The U.S. alone is expanding its troop presence here to over 6,000 soldiers to secure the evacuations. Allies, including the UK and Australia, are following suit. Meanwhile, on the streets, there's a heavy presence of Taliban fighters rolling in seized government vehicles. They've started collecting civilians' weapons, saying the items are no longer needed for their personal protection. Peace has come, they say, and they're projecting a message of restraint. The Taliban leader told Reuters that his fighters are under strict orders not to do anything to scare civilians. The group has said all women will need to wear a hijab, the partial head covering, but they'll be allowed to work and seek an education. On Sunday, the Taliban also said there would be a general amnesty for government workers and Afghans who collaborated with U.S. and allied forces after reports last week that Afghan troops that had surrendered were being executed. The Taliban released this video they say is of interviews with Kabul residents. This man is saying everything is good. Still, a government worker told Reuters that he was hiding in his friend's house and that he feared a return to the policies the Taliban had when they last held power 20 years ago. He told us his family is making sure they have enough burqas to cover his wife and daughters from head to toe.
Much of the political leadership of Afghanistan abandoned the country as the Taliban took Kabul, leaving millions of citizens to fend for themselves. In Kabul, while thousands rushed to the airport in an attempt to flee, civilians in other parts of Afghanistan are finding ways to seek shelter in neighbouring countries. But are Afghanistan's neighbours prepared to handle an influx of refugees?
The fate of millions of Afghans hangs by a thread. They are desperate to escape the rule of Taliban in their country. This heart-wrenching image is from inside Reach 871. A United States C-17 military cargo plane packed with 640 Afghans trying to escape the Taliban. The Air Force evacuation flight from Kabul to Qatar came near the record for most people flown in the Boeing airlifter. According to a U.S. defense official, the U.S. military cargo plane was not intending to take on such a large load. But in panic, several Afghans, including women and children who had been cleared to evacuate, pulled themselves on the C-17's half-open ramp. On Monday, videos from the Hamid Karzai International Airport showed thousands of Afghans on the tarmac rushing towards a US C-17 in an attempt to flee the country. While some were seen clinging to the passenger air bridge, others, in utter desperation, held on to the plane's tires. According to reports, at least 2 people died after they fell from the aircraft soon after its takeoff. Satellite images showed the chaos at Kabul airport. Tens of thousands of civilians outside Kabul have also abandoned their homes. They are making every effort to escape the Taliban rule. They are now trying to find shelter in neighboring nations. The UN Refugee Agency estimates that 400,000 Afghans have already fled their homes this year. In Central Asian nations, the governments anticipate a large influx of refugees. Uzbekistan, Afghanistan's neighbor, is already witnessing an inflow of Afghans. Uzbekistan forced the landing of 46 Afghan military aircraft carrying 585 troops. All of them had illegally crossed its border. 158 civilians and military personnel have crossed over the Amu Darya River into Uzbekistan over the last 2 days. They're all facing criminal investigation. Tajikistan, that shares a 1,350-kilometer border with Afghanistan, allowed several military planes carrying Afghan soldiers to enter the country's airspace. Sensing a migrant crisis, this 5-kilometer-long and 3-meter-high wall is being built by Turkey along its border with Iran to prevent a refugee influx. Ankara is planning to build a wall along its entire 295-kilometer-long border with Iran. The walls will be complemented with other deterrents such as barbed wires and trenches.
Turkey is facing a growing migration wave of Afghans transitioning through Iran. We will continue to make efforts to bring stability to the region, starting with Afghanistan.
Pakistan had already closed its border with Afghanistan. The Imran Khan government has said that it has already reached its limit and cannot accept more Afghan refugees. Vehicles loaded with goods crossed a Pakistan-Afghanistan border point at Torkham as the two neighbors continue bilateral trade. Concerns in Europe have also grown over the increase in Afghan refugees seeking shelter. The Lithuanian government has said that Afghan refugees have begun arriving in the country via Belarus. It is suggested that a new migrant route could be in its infancy. With the Taliban taking over, fear and dread has gripped every province of Afghanistan. Leaving their homes behind, desperate Afghans are trying every route possible to escape the feared rule of Taliban in their homeland. But with this mass exodus, fear of a possible refugee crisis looms large. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
The new reality in Afghanistan poses a significant threat to women's rights, safety and freedoms in the now Taliban-led country. Though the Taliban is claiming it will take a moderate stance this time regarding diktats imposed on women, the situation on the ground may be worsening. According to reports, women in Afghanistan have already started to lose jobs and are being admonished for showing their faces in public. And concerns are growing that 2 decades of boosted educational, social and political rights are about to be undone. Amid this chaos and uncertainty, legislator Farzana Kokai says she fears for her life first and her freedom next. Like many other Afghans, she is laying low at home with no idea how the situation will pan out for elected representatives and female rights activists like her.
As an MP, as a female, as someone who is coming from civil society activism and human rights, women's rights activism, so coming from these background, for sure I'm afraid of myself, my life, and my freedom to work and my freedom to speak up. These are the things that I'm afraid of losing them, because all of them are for me, like for you, for everyone. If you can't work, you can't talk, you can't go out, so that won't be a good life that you're having, and you can't define it as a life totally.
Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai has also raised concerns over the situation of women. She's urging US President Joe Biden to take a bold step to protect Afghan civilians. She says other countries also have to help protect people suffering by opening their borders for Afghans looking for shelter.
I am deeply concerned about the situation in Afghanistan right now, especially about the safety of women and girls there. I had the opportunity to talk to a few activists in Afghanistan, including women's rights activists, and they are sharing their concern that they are not sure what their life is going to be like. A lot of them remember what was happening in the 1996 till 2001 time, and they're deeply worried about their safety, their right, their protection. They're worried about their access to school. And we have already seen news reports that many girls have been sent back from university. A lot of them have been asked to get married, at age 15, 12.
Meanwhile, many women who are living outside Afghanistan and were hoping to return to their homeland are heartbroken. They say that their dreams have been shattered. Thousands of Afghan refugees have been living in India, most of them in various settlements in the capital, New Delhi. At one of the refugee community residential areas, there is a sense of loss along with a feeling of fear for loved ones stuck in Afghanistan. US President Joe Biden has finally broken his silence about the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. Addressing the nation, Joe Biden struck a defiant tone and said he stood squarely behind his decision to withdraw US troops from Afghanistan. The US president rejected broad criticism of the chaos left behind by the American withdrawal. He blamed the Taliban takeover on Afghan political leaders who fled the country in the time of crisis.
I stand squarely behind my decision.
Facing fierce blowback for the chaos that ensued after the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, President Joe Biden Monday defended his administration's handling of the evacuation, saying that while the Taliban's rise was quicker than expected, Afghanistan's political leaders fled the country and left behind an Afghan army unwilling to fight the militant Islamists.
This did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision.
He has also blamed his predecessor, former President Donald Trump, for empowering the Taliban and leaving them, quote, in the strongest position militarily since 2001. The decision to withdraw sparked criticism from allies and adversaries after the Afghan government collapsed within days and the U.S. scrambled to evacuate American civilians and embassy employees from Kabul. The Taliban's advance led to harrowing scenes of thousands of civilians desperate to flee the country, prompting the U.S. on Monday to temporarily suspend evacuations. A social media video showed Afghans desperately clinging to the outside of a U.S. military aircraft on the tarmac at the airport in Kabul, and later, this video that showed objects falling from a plane.
But if Afghanistan is unable to mount any real resistance to the Taliban now, there is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years, or 20 more years of U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference.
The political risks facing Biden for this decision, however, remain to be seen. Many Americans have expressed support for Trump and Biden's decision to leave Afghanistan, America's longest war. Biden also said his decision is a result of the commitment he made to American troops that he wasn't going to ask them to continue to risk their lives for a war that should have ended long ago. Biden coupled his defense with a warning to Taliban leaders, let the U.S. withdrawal proceed unimpeded.
If they attack our personnel or disrupt our operation, the U.S. presence will be swift and the response will be swift and forceful. We will defend our people with devastating force if necessary.
The US has laid out conditions for recognizing a Taliban government. The US State Department says that would only happen if the Taliban respects the rights of women and shuns extremism.
That a future Afghan government that upholds the basic rights of its people, that doesn't harbor terrorists, and that protects the basic rights of its people, including the basic fundamental rights of half of its population, its women and girls. That is a government that we would be able to work with.
The US military has reported contact with the Taliban regarding the status of the Kabul airport. Currently, US forces are in charge of the airport as they facilitate evacuations of thousands of Americans and some Afghan staff. Meanwhile, Afghan politician Gulbuddin Hekmatyar will be heading to Doha to meet the Taliban delegation. He will be accompanied by former Afghan President Hamid Karzai and the head of the High Council for National Reconciliation, Abdullah Abdullah. The US envoy to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, remains in Qatar, the Taliban's diplomatic base, where US officials have been in talks with insurgents. Qatar had called on the Taliban to consider a ceasefire and not let the tensions escalate. Doha has facilitated various rounds of meetings between the Taliban and the Afghan government for months. There has been no significant progress. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he intends to host a virtual meeting of G7 leaders to tackle the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. Johnson has stepped up efforts to evacuate UK nationals and others from the Taliban-controlled capital. Downing Street says he hopes to hold the G7 meeting in the coming days. Johnson spoke to French President Emmanuel Macron on Monday to agree on how the two countries could work together to recognise any future Afghan government and how the two countries could try to prevent a humanitarian and refugee crisis. The two leaders also agreed they should work together with the UN Security Council, including on a possible joint resolution. British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, meanwhile, says Western partners might also look at imposing sanctions and withholding aid.
I think has been surprised by the scale and the pace at which the Taliban have taken over in Afghanistan, and that's a lesson that we've all got to learn from. But the truth is, what matters right now is focusing on getting British nationals out, getting out those who have so loyally served the UK, and making sure that the gains that we've made over 20 years are not lost.
British troops are currently working to bring home British nationals and those Afghan citizens who had worked for the British Army there. The UK had initially committed 600 soldiers to help in the evacuation, but that's now increased to 900. Our London Bureau Chief, Mandy Clark, reports.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is planning to host a virtual meeting of G7 leaders to discuss Afghanistan as Britain steps up its efforts to evacuate its nationals and others from Kabul. Now, the group is likely to discuss how they would recognize any future Afghan government and how to prevent a humanitarian crisis from unfolding. The call is expected to happen in the coming days, and they could also look at imposing sanctions and withholding aid if the Taliban fail to uphold human rights and allow the country to become a base for terrorism again. Mandy Clark, World is One, WION, London.
Away from Afghanistan now, and Canada is preparing for snap polls on September the 20th after Prime Minister Trudeau called for federal elections 2 years ahead of schedule. While Trudeau is hoping to gain a majority and is betting on high vaccination rates and post-pandemic economic recovery, the main opposition party, Conservative Party, is pledging it would bring back jobs that were lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic and says it would balance the federal budget. Campaigning is already underway. Let's take a look at the main contenders.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has called an early election for September, 2 years ahead of schedule, seeking voters' approval for his costly economic recovery plan.
This is a really important moment in Canada's history.
Trudeau is betting that high vaccination rates and an economic rebound will help him prolong and strengthen his grip on power. His Liberal Party plans to inject another $80 billion into the economy over the next 3 years. Here is a look at the federal party leaders facing off in September. Justin Trudeau has been Prime Minister since November 2015, after he became the first leader to take a Canadian party from third place to an election win. Trudeau, the son of former Liberal Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, has championed women's rights, toughened environmental laws, and spent heavily to support businesses and individuals during lockdowns. His party lost their parliamentary majority in 2019 after old photos emerged of him dressed in blackface. He's twice been found in breach of federal ethics rules. Aaron O'Toole, a former Army helicopter navigator, was elected to lead the Conservatives in August 2020. He favors low spending and accuses Trudeau of corruption. He faces tension with social conservatives in his party over issues like climate change and abortion. Jagmeet Singh made headlines in 2017 when he became the first person from an ethnic minority to be elected leader of a major Canadian political party. Polls suggest that Singh, who favors even more public spending than Trudeau, is gaining in popularity after a slow start. His left-leaning party lost almost 40% of its seats in 2019. Annamie Paul is the first Black person to head a mainstream Canadian federal party. The activist and lawyer was elected leader of the Greens in October 2020, but has recently become mired in a dispute over policy toward Israel that threatens to undermine the party. Maxime Bernier is a former cabinet minister who was once forced to step down from the foreign affairs portfolio after mislaying secret documents. He defected from the Conservatives to create the populist PPC in 2018, though the party has performed poorly and Bernier lost his seat in 2019. He was arrested in June in Manitoba for attending a rally against lockdown restrictions.
And finally, brass bands have had a long tradition in Serbia, stretching back to a royal decree establishing a military ensemble in 1831. In the small Serbian town of Guka, a brass band festival has returned with thousands of visitors. They attended the 60th edition, despite a surge in COVID cases in Serbia. That is all we have for today. Thanks for watching WION. Do stay tuned.
It is obvious that the attendance cannot be the same, because the citizens are prevented from coming as not all of them can comply with the given or rather recommended measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19. It should be noted that to attend Guka Festival this year, a vaccination certificate is mandatory, or a certificate that you had the disease or that you have relevant negative test results.
No, not scared. We take precaution like everybody, and it's okay. It's okay. We are happy to be there in Serbia.
Situation is like that everywhere in the world, and we have to learn to live with that. And we cannot stop the music. We cannot stop to live just for a virus. The fear, we have to take it out and live these kind of moments. Just live the music, live the culture, live it, help together to live better. That's everything that we can do.